Hey y'all, happy week 3. It's me, LT, here, and this is our next local history report. And I'm going to talk to you today about the American Revolution. And I know you're probably thinking, well, how the heck is Illinois and St. Louis and Kendry connected to the American Revolution? Well, we are. And the place that I brought you today, first I'm going to give you like a little circle around and then I'm going to talk about it. So I'm sitting outside a farmer's market. And I'm kind of hanging out here in the shade under a tree, first of all because it's hot, and second of all because there's traffic on the street, so it's a little hard to hear me if cars are flying by. But I don't know if you could gauge from where I was and some of the street signs, I am in downtown Ferguson. Yes, the Ferguson, Missouri. And you should all be familiar with Ferguson because of the events that happened in August of 2014 when Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown, 18-year-old Michael Brown, about a mile from where I'm sitting. And where I'm sitting right now is on Florissant Avenue, which is the site of protests that happened not only in the wake of Michael Brown's death, but when the verdict came out that Officer Darren Wilson was found not guilty. And so the protests that happened where I'm standing were national news. They were showcased all over the country, and we saw some cars being flipped. The CVS about a little ways up the street from here was looted and caught on fire. And we saw police in riot gear, and it seemed like a war zone in this area. Now, I didn't live here in 2014. I was in Florida finishing my PhD at Florida State, but I have heard from lots of people who were here at the protests and in some of the groups that I follow very closely that most of the 90% of the protesting during the day was marching, chanting, obviously in anger and frustration, but at night sometimes things would become unhinged and we would see some looting, some burning, and obviously some arrests for those who were destroying property and being violent. So you're probably thinking, okay, LT, we've heard about that. Why are we talking about it for this week? Well, the reason I brought you to a site of protest is because in 2014 and even this summer, the protests that we've seen nationwide in the wake of George Floyd's murder are part of American culture, right? The right to protest, right? And where did that grow out of? Well, we might think, oh, from the Bill of Rights, because it's in our First Amendment. However, it actually began in 1765 in the city of Boston, and you will see on your PowerPoint this week an image of men who were looting and burning the governor of Massachusetts' home, his governor's estate, because they were angry at the Stamp Act, right? And those men were rich colonial elites. They were merchants and they were lawyers and they were highly educated, and they were mad that they had to pay money on official documents known as the Stamp Act. And those men will famously become known as the Sons of Liberty, right? And so the Sons of Liberty, who come together, a couple hundred men, and they loot and they burn the governor's mansion, and then they protest around Boston and in New England, and they damage storefronts, and they burn effigies of stamp collectors, and they threaten to kill them. And then it culminates where in 1770 in Boston, the British troops, the law enforcement that were there, fired into a crowd and killed an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Cedar. And when this boy died, the protests amped up even more, just like what we saw here in Ferguson. And when the protests amped up even more, that's when we see the royal troops, the redcoats, the law enforcement, fire into the crowd, shooting 11 people and killing 5, which becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And when the Boston Massacre happens, right, people all across the colonies are saying those radical protesters are too violent, they need to quit that. And if you don't believe me, the person who actually represented, the lawyer for the British troops, who not only represented them but got them off, they were acquitted, was our very own writer of the Declaration and second president, John Adams. So even somebody who later would become an American president in 1770 was like, this is wrong. They shouldn't have been protesting. I support the troops. I support the law enforcement. And so when we see this happen, right, we side with the Sons of Liberty. God damn it, those troops, they should have been locked up. We should have had these protesters demand justice, because that's how we think. Because the Sons of Liberty are heroes that brought us to the United States, right? Or brought us to be eventually the United States. However, do we feel the same in 2014, right? Do we side with the troops or do we side with the protesters? And if we side with the troops, then why don't we side with the protesters like we sided with the Sons of Liberty, right? Let me take it a step further. In 1773, also in Boston, the Tea Act was passed, well, across all of the colonies, and people did not want to pay the tax on tea. And so they boycotted. And there was a ship inside Boston Harbor from the East India Tea Company that was full of tea because the people were not buying it. And it couldn't go back to England with tea. They had to go back to England with money. And so it was just sitting there in Boston Harbor full of tea. And about 50 Sons of Liberty, right? Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, James Otis, oh my gosh, why can't I think of his name? The guy who did the Midnight Ride. Why am I having a brain fart? William Dawes. Why can't I think of his name? Okay, y'all, I like totally blinked on his name. Paul Revere, there we go. Woo, got it. Okay, so Paul Revere, these are the guys who dress up as Mohawks. They had to disguise themselves because what they were doing was illegal. They sneak onto the boat and they throw all the tea in the harbor. Do you know how much money was lost in the harbor floating that day? $2 million, right? So 50 dudes in a matter of 3 hours destroyed $2 million of British corporate money, right? Talk about property damage, right? Talk about corporate losses. And it was a message because Parliament cracked down, they closed Boston Harbor, took away their charter, sent more troops. Those are known as the Intolerable Acts, and they literally put them on lockdown. But while they're doing this, the Sons of Liberty say, well, we're going to push back. We're going to form militias. We're going to get these farmers in the countryside all excited about protecting our land, not paying these taxes. So they stockpile weapons. The British go to get them. And that's what becomes known as Lexington and Concord, which is seen as the official first battles of the War for Independence. So with all this said, right, we like to boil this period down to 2 little phrases: taxation without representation and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But as you know, it's not that easy, right? It's not so simple. We as Americans like to call those phrases, say Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, we went to war, Washington kicked ass, call it a day, right? But there's a lot here in this period, and there's a lot to unpack, right? We protested against our government. We did so violently. We did so with property damage. We had a rebellion. We went to war, and we won, right? And we celebrate that rebellion. We celebrate that protest because it's how we became the United States, right? So that's the ultimate question. Is if we say Sons of Liberty are great, don't tread on me, right? But then in 2014, we say that people who are protesting are un-American, right? Or unpatriotic. But that's what we were born out of, is protest, right? And so yes, the ultimate question of our government, state, local, and federal, is how do we say people can protest but do so where we don't have anarchy, right? But then the flip side of it is if we look at protesters, whether it be teachers striking for better pay, or we see Black Lives Matter protests, or we see LGBTQ plus people protesting for equal health care, right? And we look at them and say, that's un-American, you can't protest your government. Well, the Sons of Liberty did, and that's how we started, right? And so that's why I brought you to Ferguson, because Ferguson is a site of protest, but it gets a really bad name. And as I'm sitting here, I'll show you a little screenshot again. We have a farmer's market with kids and families, and actually, as I'm standing right here, everybody I see is Caucasian. And then we see the Ferguson Brewing Company, which is really great. Very good food and beverages that y'all obviously don't partake in because you're not of age. Here we see an apartment complex, and basically Ferguson is a working class neighborhood. Where it's located, for those of you who might not have seen it, like driven by it on the interstate, is it's just a smidge east of Lambert International Airport and just a smidge north of I-70. So if you're coming out to St. Charles or O'Fallon, Missouri, you'll pass Ferguson right before you get to the airport. And so this is a working class neighborhood. It is obviously kind of predominantly black because of white flight. A lot of working class families moved out to St. Charles in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and mostly African Americans who were redlined and prevented from moving out to St. Charles neighborhoods remain, and that's a whole historical point of significance for another day. I'll probably take you to a place of redlining in St. Louis, which is known as the Del Mar Divide. I'll probably do that later in the semester. But yeah, I wanted to bring you to Ferguson because A, it's a site of protest, B, it gets a very negative image, and C, because we were formed out of protest and we champion the Sons of Liberty, we don't give protesters the same recognition in modern times if we don't agree with the message, right? And so even if we don't agree with the message, we have to agree that people have that right? Because that's how we were formed. And so if you carry a Don't Tread on Me flag, which is the Sons of Liberty flag, then you might not agree with the message of other protests, but you better damn well believe that we as Americans have that right. And so also with protesting, I feel like we should have reckonings with ourselves, right? If we say protesters are unpatriotic, then why, right? Why do we love the Sons of Liberty but not like the Ferguson Black Lives Matter protesters? What is inside of us that's preventing us from feeling that we support them, right? And oftentimes we will see, as Americans or as society as a whole, we deem protests good if they are by white people. And for people of color or non-Christians or any kind of minority group, when they protest, it's seen as not comfortable because it makes us uncomfortable. And so hopefully in bringing you to Ferguson, you can think about, a site of protest in St. Louis versus a site of protest in Boston, right? And Boston Harbor gets millions of tourists every year coming to take pictures and saying, this is where the Boston protest was. But we really don't see that kind of love here in Ferguson, Missouri. So it's interesting how we as Americans view what is a protest that's seen as patriotic and what's seen as unpatriotic or anti-American. But I think what we need to remember is protesting is the American way because that's how we were found. And that's how we were born, out of a big ass protest that became a civil war against our country. So hopefully this adds some perspective. Hopefully it gives you a new look at protesting and a place that is stigmatized, aka Ferguson. And if you have any questions about the video, I'd love to talk to you via message or email. And also feel free to bring up this video in our chat. Also, I'm sorry, I forgot about Paul Revere. That's not good for me. But if you look at the PowerPoint, Paul Revere got captured. He never made it to Lexington to warn the militia. It was actually Samuel Prescott that made that journey. And he was the one who was the guy who informed Lexington. So we need to have a Samuel Prescott Day or give him a statue or something, because Sammy P don't get any attention or any credit. So Sammy P deserves some credit, and I'm sorry I forgot Paul Revere's name. But anyways, I love you guys. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Thanks for listening to my chat, and yeah, keep up the great work. Keep embracing the new things you're hearing and keep critically thinking. I hope you're enjoying, and I will see you next week for week 4 local history. All right, y'all. Bye.